Hello, this is Kyle, also known as AlienTude. Today I am reviewing this Honshu Historic Forge Viking Sword. Now, right up front, I did not buy this sword. Honshu, or United Cutlery actually, the parent brand of Honshu, sent it to me for free as a review sample. All I had to do basically is do this review, and here it is. I will put a link in the description to where you can buy this sword. That link will track that it was me who referred you to their website, but there's no incentive to me for you buying the sword. So hopefully that dispels any notions of bias or anything like that. Now, the sword retails new for $255. I'll put the listing up on screen while I'm talking about it. This is listed as a historic forge Viking sword, but in my eye at least, it's not trying to replicate an historically accurate Viking era sword. It's much more of a modern take on a Viking era sword. And there is one mistake on the listing. It says it comes with a wooden scabbard. It does not. The scabbard that it comes with is actually a leather sheath. I'll get into that in just a moment. So this sword does come with a leather sheath, and I use that word sheath very intentionally. This is not really what I would consider a scabbard because it does not have a wood core to it. It is leather, and therefore it's not really appropriate for long-term storage because leather on steel can wick away the oil from the steel, leaving it unprotected. So you don't really want to leave a sword, a carbon steel sword that is not stainless steel, that needs to be oiled inside a purely leather sheath because it risks corrosion on the blade. As you can see right there, the sword doesn't actually even fit all the way in at this point. I can't get it in any further like that. If I swap it around, pretty much gets stuck there as well. I haven't been leaving it in the sheath, so it's possible the leather has adjusted in size some due to moisture in the air, dryness in the air, whatever, and it's keeping the sword from going in all the way. Doesn't really matter for my taste because this is basically, to me, all it is useful for is transport. You're going to, if you're transporting the sword somewhere, you want to protect the edge and the sword from transport damage, and you want to protect whatever's doing the transport from the edge and the sword, then the sheath is good use for that, but it's not a good use for, like I said, long-term storage. So whether or not this kind of sheath has value to you depends on what you're going to use it for. It's not good for long-term storage. It's acceptable for transport, but not if it doesn't fit the blade anymore like it doesn't for me. Looking at the hilt, this is probably the number one thing that says this sword is not historically accurate and is not really intending to be historically accurate. It's clearly inspired by Viking era swords, but this is not pretty much anything at all what Viking era swords actually looked like. So it's something to keep in mind during this review, that this is not intended to be historically accurate. Looking at both the hilt components here, these are made of brass with a bit more of a bronzy look to them, especially the pommel in the nooks and crannies. That kind of darkening color makes it look a little bit more like bronze, which I happen to like better than the look of brass. So I like that look. These are both relatively simple designs here. The pommel certainly more so than the guard. And while they evoke the spirit of Viking era swords, they definitely have a much more modern look to them. Especially in my opinion, these little cutouts on the guard are just a little too perfectly formed to my eye to be historical. But again, this is not historically accurate. It's not intended to be. So it's not really a criticism, just pointing it out. One nice thing I can say is that all the corners here have been chamfered over pretty dang well. These corners right here could bite into your hand if you're gripping it down there, but because the grip is a bit long, I'll get to that in just a moment, it doesn't really get in the way. And like a Viking era sword that has a more historically accurate grip and hilt would possibly do if you're not sure how to use it. The overall look is modern and I like it, but I do like historical accuracy a bit more. If we look at the peen on the pommel, it's pretty well done. It's shaped nicely. There is one small gap in one part, but it doesn't look to me like it's going to affect the construction here, and it is solidly constructed. There's one or two errant hammer marks, especially one on the pommel, not a big deal. And if we look at the gap in the blade, or gap in the guard where the blade meets, it's definitely not small, but it's not egregiously large either. And even if it was really large, that's not really it's not really a concern at all, because it's an aesthetic choice. In history, the gaps and guards ranged the gamut from enormous to very tightly fitted, probably more commonly on the large gap side than on the tightly fitted side. It's perfectly fine here. And if we look at the blade being centered in the guard, it is very nicely centered. It is not crooked or centered on one side, or it's perfectly centered. A lot of budget-oriented swords, they don't fit into the guard quite right, and there'll be some angles or some off-centering. Not the case here. But with the grip, there is a little bit of off-centering here. Maybe it's just that the riser here is a little bit smaller than here, because there is a bit of a ledge right here that I could see being a bit of a hot spot. Not a lot, but it is there. And I don't think that's really that much of an issue, because the grip length is a bit longer and you don't really grip, at least I don't really grip down there. But it is something to note that there is a bit of a ledge there that could be uncomfortable. So the grip is, like I said, very much ahistorical in the length. Viking era swords, I think you would typically see 3 to maybe 3.5 inches long at most. This is 4.25. Definitely a longer grip than you would see on a historically accurate replica. This is a very common thing on Viking era sword reproductions and replicas that is oftentimes missed. And I think the main reason is because Viking era swords can be tricky to use with a historically accurate grip, if you don't know the correct way to grip them and swing them. So a lot of companies will just lengthen the grip to get rid of the problem. And on a modern sword that is not intending to be historically accurate, like this one, I think that's a good compromise. If this were trying to be historically accurate and had this long of a grip, then I would have an issue with it. But since it's not, I don't. Now the grip is a bit wide here, and it doesn't have any taper in the thickness. It's a good thickness, and it's elliptical in shape, but it is rather wide at the base and has just a small amount of taper as it goes towards the pommel. I find it just a little bit wide for my taste, but I will get into the handling, how I feel the grip helps handle the sword in the handling section. All of the leather, the cord texture, and the risers here all feel and look a little bit cheap, and not in a good way. There's a way you can do things that makes them still look cheap but well done, and I don't find that to be the case here. The cord texture is soft, the risers are soft, and the leather is tacky. And I don't mean that in a lacking taste definition of the word tacky. I mean in the grippiness of it. When I'm gripping it, it feels a little sticky in a bad way. And hopefully you can get what I'm saying with this footage right here. Hopefully you heard that kind of stickiness that I'm talking about. It's a little bit unpleasant to feel, and the looks mirror that sound and that feel to my eye. It's an effective grip. I can get a good grip on this sword and swing it around. it's just not particularly pleasant to handle. The leather is stitched down one side, and the stitching is pretty straight and even. It's a little bit rough, but not terribly so. Again, I'll talk about that more during handling. Overall, it's an effective grip, but it's also probably my least favorite part of the entire sword itself. And now it's time to talk about the business end, the blade. As always, here's my measurements. So the first thing I want to talk about this sword is how it is not historically accurate. I'm not particularly judging it on historical accuracy because, let's face it, it's not really designed to be. But I do want to point out the differences between this and a more accurate replica of Viking era swords, just so that you may not know. You may look at this and say, yeah, that looks like a Viking era sword to me. Well, there's definitely some things that catch my eye as immediately being inaccurate. The first being the cross section past the fuller. It is a diamond cross section here. Now the central ridge is a rather soft one, but what you really would typically see on a Viking era sword would be a lenticular cross section, something much flatter. And this being a central ridge, it's not particularly accurate. It's something you see on a lot of budget era Viking era swords that are sold today. The next thing that I see that's, I won't say inaccurate, but not replicating a historic Viking era sword is the fuller. This is a pretty narrow fuller. Viking era swords tended to have pretty wide fullers, and this one is pretty narrow. The other thing would be the tip. Now this is not particularly acute, but it is more acute than you would normally see. Oftentimes they would be much more spatulated than this. This is probably the least of the things that says not particularly accurate to history, but it is there. Now, the rest of the blade. So it's got this Honshu stamp on it, and on the other side it has a stamp saying it was made in India and what steel it's made of. Some people hate those stamps. They don't really bother me, especially on a sword that's trying to look modern as opposed to trying to look historic. The overall finish on the sword is a mirror. It's a little bit of a dull mirror, but it is absolutely mirror. I can absolutely see my face in it or any other reflections. Because it's mirror, it scratches easily. There are definite scratches from when I was doing cutting. They don't bother me. They might bother you. When I first got this sword, it came coated in this thick layer of grease. And that grease actually left stains on the blade, or so I thought. I thought I was going to need to take some polish and polish up the blade to get rid of them. But after several re-oilings, especially after cutting with it and then oiling it again, that staining has gone completely. So it wasn't so much stains as residual grease lingering on the blade. That is good. It's less work for me, right? But in some of the close-up videos, you probably will see those, that's not staining, that residual grease, because I did some of the videoing before it all cleaned up completely. Now, the sword starts at 4.5 millimeters thick and features very little distal taper. About halfway up the blade is where it finally starts tapering, and then it's only about 1 millimeter through the rest of the blade. And because the area past the fuller is a diamond, it actually gets a little bit thicker there. This is, again, not historically accurate, and it does lead to an overall heavier blade. We'll get to more about that during cutting and handling. When I look down the surfaces of the blade, I do see a little bit of rippling throughout the entire blade, but it was really, really hard to capture it on camera. It is there, and it's consistent throughout, but it's very, very shallow rippling and actually is better than I was expecting it to be. The edge here looks to me like the sword was made as not as a blunt, but was made blunt and then was sharpened probably after it left India. I know it was made in India because it says made in India on the blade, and let's face it, most likely it left India blunt, and then United Cutlery or somebody in the US probably sharpened it. And they did a good job sharpening this. I'll get into the level of sharpness in just a moment here. But in terms of the geometry, this is not just your standard secondary bevel where the blade's going like this and then a sharp angle occurs and it's just a completely different angle. This is apple-seated. It's not perfectly apple-seated. The change from the plane to the apple seating is definitely noticeable, but it is an apple seated geometry and pretty well polished in there and done pretty dang well. The edge is a little toothy, but that's okay. That's not particularly abnormal, and it's actually very simple to fix with some stropping. But overall, I would say the sharpening on this was done pretty well. So paper cutting. Once again, as always, this is more about giving you a baseline of how sharp the sword is so you can use that when watching the cutting footage. So it started that cut pretty easily, and the cut is a little jagged, but not too bad. And then once I got down a little bit, it did stall and stop cutting. Pretty much exactly the same. Started the cut very easily and then stalled out and stopped the cut. Let's test the other edge. All right, here is the other edge. So that edge, it's a little bit smoother of a cut. Still some jaggedness to it, but a little bit smoother. That time, that was me moving the paper while doing the cut. So it is definitely effectively sharp up in the top portion of the blade where you want it to be sharp. And it gets a little bit duller, a little bit further away, but I think that's a good effective sharpness. Moving on to cutting. Now, I want to say, first off, I did not cut tatami with this sword. Why is that? Well, after cutting water bottles and my normal targets with it, while it cut those decently, you'll see that in a second, I could tell from the way I was able to cut with it that I would not be able to do a good job on tatami with this sword, and I don't want to waste a tatami mat on me flailing with the sword and attempting to cut with it and ending up just bashing the hell out of the tatami. That's not to say the sword is not sharp enough to cut tatami. It's not crazy sharp, but it is sharp enough to cut it. And I think it could cut tatami in a capable cutter's hands. I just don't think those hands are mine with my current level of ability. And I don't think it would be of particular value. Now, let's go to water bottles, my favorite target. I won't say favorite, my most common target. So my very first cut on this with this sword, you'll see that here. It cut pretty decently, but I tried to do the cut and stop of the sword. And after that very first cut, I said, nope, I am not trying to stop the motion on any of these cuts. I'm going to go ahead and continue the motion and bring the sword back around because this is not a light and nimble sword. But we'll get into that more during the handling section. In terms of how this sword cuts water bottles, it's pretty good. It's got a sharp enough edge, it's pretty rigid, and therefore it's going to be able to cut water bottles pretty easily, even if I don't have particularly good edge alignment. I'm not so sure I would call it fun to cut with because it is a beast of a sword. At over 3 pounds, I feel it when I'm swinging it around pretty easily. And while it's not balanced a crazy way out from the hilt, it's still got a little bit further point of balance than my preference for single-handed swords. That's not to say that's wrong or incorrect for this type, just my preference. That said, it can deliver very satisfying cuts. Some of these cuts on water bottles shocked me. I was not expecting to get as good of cuts and have the water bottles drop close to the stand as much as they did. I was expecting, honestly, when I first took this out there, I was expecting it to bash water bottles around, smash them up, crumple them, but not really cut them very well. It proved me wrong. This sword is definitely a capable backyard cutter. And I want to talk about one more thing in regards to cutting with this sword. When I first saw it on the website when I first picked it up and, moved it around a little bit, my first thought both times was backyard beater. That's a term that has a lot of connotations to it, but a lot of people have a desire for a sword that they can just take into the backyard and beat on pretty much whatever target they want, whether that's water bottles, tatami, pool noodles, or wood, or branches, or pretty much anything. And my first thought was, well, I will probably go ahead and test it on some branches, that kind of thing. However, Honshu did include in the packaging of this sword that it is not intended for use against trees. Now, I believe they said that it's not intended to chop down trees or anything like that. But I decided I'm not going to do it on wood or branches, specifically because their instructions said it's not an appropriate target. Otherwise, I would have done that. All right, let's talk about how this sword handles. And I'm not actually going to be doing any comparisons to this sword because I just don't have any good swords to compare it to that are similar to this sword. I do have the Windless Land Jade, but that is a very different sword, a very different feel. What I can say between the two of them, they handle completely differently. So it really doesn't make much sense to do a detailed comparison when there's pretty much no similarity at all. So the first thing I want to talk about while in the handling section is how the grip interfaces with my hand. I find this grip to be a little bit wide and the seam to be a little bit more prominent than I would like. I would not say that the seam is a hot spot, especially if I put it on my fingers. If I put the seam on my palm though, it does rub a little bit uncomfortably. It's not terrible, but it is a noticeable seam, and I would like that to be smoothed over and just, it's the stitching that is the thread that is a little bit uncomfortable, and I would like that to be improved. In terms of how good of a grip I can get, you can see I can't really crank the sword around in my hand at all. So the grip is effective in that manner. Now, I talked about this during the hilt section. The grip is ahistorical of how long it is. That's a pretty common thing with budget Viking era swords, or swords that are inspired by Viking era swords at the budget price. What that does, though, is makes this easier to use and to move around, because with Viking era swords, usually this grip is going to be stopped right about here, and the pommel is going to be more like you're going to end up gripping the pommel a little bit or having it slide in your hand along the palm to keep these very sharp corners. They're not actually sharp here, but just the overall geometry is relatively sharp, to keep those from biting into your hand or digging into your wrist or anything. There's also ways of using a Viking sword where you can just do a full hammer grip and not have to worry about that. There's debate about the proper way to grip and use a Viking era sword. The point I'm driving at here, though, is with this longer of a grip, it's not really a concern because the pommel shape doesn't really interact with my hand, at least, because there's a good half-inch there between the grip and the pommel. So while ahistorical in some ways, it does improve the handling. And being real here, this sword needs every little bit of advantage it can get in the handling and more, because it's not a particularly well-handling sword. It is heavy. It is 3 pounds and a little over 2 ounces, and you feel that. It's not that it's balanced poorly. That's around 5.5 inches, that looks like. I haven't done my full measurements yet. And that's perfectly within the historical record for Viking era swords. A little over 3 pounds is certainly within the historical record. But I don't want to say problem, because that's a matter of opinion. But what's going on here is that the blade starts at around 4.5 millimeters thick and features very little distal taper. It does thin out to around 3.5 millimeters out towards this way. But then once the fuller ends, it swells back up because it has that ahistoric diamond cross section that I talked about. And that adds some weight out here towards the tip. And like I mentioned, the fuller is a little narrow for a Viking era sword, which again adds to the weight, or rather it doesn't reduce the weight as much as a wider fuller would do. All that to be said, this is a beefy sword and it feels beefy. Just picking it up and swinging it, I feel it almost right away. It's heavy and it's not blade heavy, but there is a lot of weight out here. I wouldn't say that it's too heavy, but this sword definitely does drag the tip. As I swing it, the tip wants to keep dragging down and create that ulnar deviation where the wrist, you want the wrist, in line with your arm. You don't want to deviate it and have the sword angled down like that. And this sword wants to do that to me, at least in my hands. Now, I found that when I was cutting with it, using it in sweeping motions and continuing cuts, don't try to stop the cut because the momentum here does not feel good to swing and stop. Instead, swing and then continue the motion. I'm not doing very much here because I have a fireplace right back there. I don't want to hit the wall or my mantle or anything. But yeah, you saw me when I was cutting, I very quickly switched to continuing the motion to bring the sword back around to the front rather than trying to stop the cut, move it around and bring it back in place. I found that to work a lot better for this sword, and it made it a lot easier to cut or just to handle the sword in general. A couple other things to note. If we look at the vibration nodes, the blade one is right around here. A pretty good spot for that. It is getting a little close to the duller part of the sword, but I think it's still in an effective sharpness area there. However, what I noticed, it's really hard to see this, but the other node is like right at the base of the sword, right at the crossguard. That would really ideally be a little bit further into the hilt, right around here, right in this area, so that it's where your hand is holding the grip, where you really want that percussion node to be. So that's the area that has the least vibrations when the sword impacts something, and therefore the least vibrations that translate into your arm and create some unpleasant shock. Now, this is still relatively close to that spot. It's not terrible, but it's definitely less than ideal. I didn't really have any hand shock when using the sword, so it wasn't a problem, just something I noticed. Now, as for sword wind, it's not easy to do that indoors because it's not fun to stop the sword. I was almost hitting the floor there. But it does generate some sword wind, not a lot, and I wasn't accelerating it particularly fast there either. Again, I didn't want to accelerate a sword really fast in here and then just smash into my carpet here. So it does generate some sword wind, probably would generate considerably more if I was actually swinging at speed. So the way this sword handles is really reinforcing my opinion about this sword and what I think of it, who I think it's for, and who would enjoy this sword. And I will get to that in a moment when I get to the bottom line section. Now, there are definitely some areas that could be improved on this sword to make it better overall. The first being historical accuracy. I know this is not intended to be historically accurate, but mimicking some of the historical design features would help this sword out overall. And the primary one there is the blade design. The fact that it's not a lenticular cross-section, that's a bit of an eyesore to me because I see Viking era swords, I expect a lenticular cross-section, but getting it there would also help the handling a little bit. But more important than that would be implementing better distal taper. This starts at 4.5 millimeters thick, which is a perfectly fine thickness for this style of sword, very much in the historical record. But it has almost no distal taper. The first half of the blade, it pretty much doesn't taper at all. And then it only tapers about a millimeter out towards the tip. And it's just not enough. It makes the sword heavier than it needs to be. Now, the sword itself is balanced by the chunky pommel and crossguard in brass, which is heavier than steel. So it's not that it's overly blade heavy. It's balanced at around 6 inches, and that's up within the historical record. Also, it makes sense for the style of sword, but it's just makes the entire sword a little bit heavy. If there was a better implementation of distal taper, getting this out maybe a full another millimeter, get it down to about 2.5 out near the tip, this would be a lighter sword. The pommel and crossguard could be a little bit lighter, and overall it would be a more pleasant handling sword. Next up is the grip. I don't like the leather being used here. I don't like the cord texture of the risers. I think a little bit more attention to quality materials here and craftsmanship would make this grip much more pleasant to use. Lastly would be the leather sheath. I find no value in including it whatsoever because it's inappropriate for long-term storage. You can't trust a leather sheath to keep the blade from rusting, and it's just the material feels just as bad as the grip leather, and I don't find any value to it being included with the sword. I would much rather Honshu would nix the sheath entirely, take whatever that added to the cost of the sword, and put it into the blade, put it into the grip especially. Get this better quality leather with the cost of that sheath, and I think you would have a better sword overall and a better deal in the price overall. All right, bottom line, this sword sells for $255. Is it worth that price? Well, I'm going to get one part of this out right up front. For me, not really. But I don't think this sword is aimed at me. While I like the aesthetic of Viking era swords, I've never really found one that I really like the handling of. And this aesthetic, which is Viking inspired but modern, I can appreciate what they were going for here. They went for a specific look, and I think they achieved that look. That look doesn't appeal to me. In addition, the handling here is a bit rougher than a Viking era sword, and it's not the type of handling that I appreciate. So this is not really a sword that is going to appeal to me pretty much ever. If I were browsing through a website and looking for swords, I would pretty much pass by this one because it just doesn't grab me. It's not something that I look at and say, I want to buy. But I'm not the only market out there. So who is this sword intended for? You know, I've talked at least once in this video about a forming opinion about who I think this is for. And what I'm thinking is that this sword is intended for people who are not particularly sword collectors. They might want one or two swords just to have a sword, because swords are cool, right? Why else are we all here? And they like the idea of a Viking era sword, but they don't really care about historical accuracy. They just want something that says, I'm a Viking sword and I'm cheap, I'm inexpensive. You know, they don't want to spend $1,200 on an Albion Viking era sword. They want to just buy one that they can take into the backyard, swing around, feel like a badass, and chop up some fruit, some bottles, whatever the heck they want to cut up. And for them, this isn't that bad. It's not, like I said, it's not going to give them an idea of what a historical sword typically would handle like, but it is going to do what that idea, it's going to do that. It's going to say, look at me, I look badass, I'm a Viking era sword. It's going to cut through basic targets. It definitely surprised me with how good it cuts. And it is inexpensive at $255. There's not many Viking era inspired swords in that price range. Windlass has some. I believe the Hanwei Tinker Viking Sword is roughly in that price range, but that one is much plainer. And Windlass has some options that are going to be pretty similar to this one. This is another option. And Honshu is a name that has some brand recognition. So it makes sense that they would want to put out a sword like this. So I guess what I'm saying is, for me, I don't think it's worth it. I think my hunch is that the majority of sword collectors will not find it particularly worthwhile. But for the people who just want a sword, who want a Viking sword, I think they would love this. And for this, it might be a good option for them. And that's going to wrap up this review. I want to give a big thank you to United Cutlery for sending me this sword to review. And to you, thank you for sitting through and watching the video. If you haven't yet, make sure you're subscribed, hit the like button, leave a comment, do all those things so that YouTube knows you like the video, you want to see more like it, and it will help the channel continue to grow. Until next time, Alien Toot out.